Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Cloud Deployment Models presented by Neovera, where you will learn more about the 5 R's to help you decide on the right deployment model for your current infrastructure. This webinar is intended for those who are just beginning their journey to the cloud, but if you are already there, we hope you will still find this information useful. The webinar will give you an overview of the various cloud deployment models, help you understand how you can leverage each of these models, and also give you case studies with examples of these models in action. And now our presenters for today are Dana Lees, Director of Technology Implementation Services. Dana has over 20 years of experience successfully delivering industry-leading enterprise-wide solutions. She also leads up the Azure migration practices at Neovera. Our second presenter is Andrew Stuvey, Enterprise Architect. Andy has over 30 years of IT experience focusing on infrastructure and back office systems. He is also responsible for having helped transform Neovera's hosting platform from a traditional hosting environment to current private cloud with public integration. So before we start our presentation today, we do have a few housekeeping items. First, if you could please post your questions in the questions window on the side of your screen. We will do our best to answer all at the end of the slide presentation. Second, we will be asking you, the viewers, a participation question in a few minutes. Please post your answer in the chat window, and the first 3 answers will be receiving a gift from Neovera. And without further ado, I will now hand this presentation over to Dana Lees. Dana, all yours.
Thank you, Shar. All right, so as you begin your journey to the cloud, there are multiple cloud deployment models to choose from. Before you start considering any of the service models available in the cloud, you'll first want to apply the 5 R's of rationalization. Those are rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, or replace. I will provide some examples of where these R's apply as we walk through the various deployment models. Andy will also revisit the 5 R's later on in the presentation. Starting in the upper left, most of you should all be familiar with the traditional on-prem models where all your software and technologies are located in your company's own data center. This is the environment that you'll be making your rationalization decisions against. Now, moving to the lower left, we have infrastructure as a service, which provides the basic building blocks for compute, storage, and other networking capabilities. IaaS is the model for all rehost decisions. This past year, a very popular selection for organizations around the world has been Windows Virtual Desktop as workforces went remote due to the pandemic. This is a rehost decision, moving from all desktops managed on-prem to desktops managed virtually in the cloud to support employees remotely in their day-to-day work. Now in the lower left, we have the platform as a service model. Here, you're able to leverage deployment tools, database management, and business analytics directly from your cloud provider. You'll need to consider refactoring, re-architecting, or rebuilding your applications to take advantage of the PaaS model. You may opt to rebuild an application so that you can take advantage of App Services, which is a fully managed web hosting service for building web applications, mobile backends, and RESTful APIs. You might decide to re-architect a system so you can leverage SQL database as a service. That includes serverless compute and hyperscale storage. Now in the upper right, we have software as a service. This is where you connect to a cloud-based application over the internet and ensure that it is integrated with your other applications that are either on-prem or in the cloud. The biggest example of this option is Microsoft 365. With the SaaS model, you'll want to consider any software products that you're currently hosting on-prem and evaluate whether you can get the same functionality in the cloud. This is a replace option. And there are so many SaaS options out there. There are finance and accounting software, sales and marketing systems, HR systems. There's customer support systems like Atlassian and Zendesk, products like Adobe Creative Cloud. There's even Citrix Cloud. Literally hundreds of SaaS providers are out there now that can make your day-to-day management of systems much, much easier. Now in the middle, we have the hybrid approach as a deployment model. An example of where you may use this approach is that your applications are cloud ready and you want to move them right away to the cloud, which is a rehost IaaS type decision. But you've also made the decision that you want to re-architect the data tier to leverage database as a service. So the data tier is not ready yet to move to the cloud. You can move forward with the application migration and integrate them back to the existing on-prem data tier while you work on the re-architecture. This is the hybrid solution. It allows you the flexibility to keep legacy applications and data on-premise, and in parallel, the ability to use new cloud-first technology. Now, very common is a combination of these models, which is referred to as multi-cloud. This involves the use of cloud services from more than one cloud provider to mix and match to get the best combination to meet your business needs. Now, keep in mind that not everything should go into the cloud, and moving to the cloud is more than just flipping a switch. Now, Andy's going to share with you an example case study of a cloud migration lift and shift, which is a hybrid on-prem IaaS and SaaS solution.
Thank you, Dana. So for this first, just a walkthrough of a case study, we have what's simply a lift and shift migration for most people. This was a small migration. We aren't talking about a large number of servers, but what most would consider a small to mid-sized office that had an aging infrastructure and DR in a local data center that they weren't satisfied with. They were virtualized already, but we're going to have to make an investment in a new SAN and servers in the near future. Overall, the environment was not complex, with Windows servers for the majority and a single Linux SMTP server for email campaigns. They were on a single flat network with a modern UTM firewall providing security and VPN services. So, for the cloud deployment, they decided to utilize the same vendor firewall as an appliance in the cloud. This allowed them to create a VPN between the office and cloud sites, and gave them the ability to use the same VPN client for users to connect to either location. For rehosting the VM, the lift and shift operation, the cloud provider's native migration tool was deployed on site, and the servers were easily replicated to the destination. A couple of the servers, like the file share, was deployed as a new VM in the destination, and the data replicated using DFS. When it came to moving the Linux SMTP server, they decided to replace that function with SendGrid instead of having to manage something that wasn't exactly in their wheelhouse. Now, we, of course, had to have all this approved in the plans for the customer. And once the architecture and approach was approved, the actual work to do this migration was less than 30 days. This included the initial migration of the VM to the cloud, testing of the VMs in the cloud provider, both accessed remotely and from the office. They shifted their email to a SaaS solution, Microsoft 365. Instead of managing their own email server, let Microsoft do it for them. Finally, they did the final cutover over one night, and the users saw no problems. They were there, they had their cloud deployment, and business went on. Fairly simple. As I said, it wasn't a large place. The use of a single flat network in the cloud made it a much simpler transition for them. And being able to use the same VPN on the laptops for all their users, especially in the time of COVID, this was a very simple migration. But now we're going to ask a question on a larger migration.
All right, thanks, Andy. That was great information on the cloud migration lift and shift. Now we will have the quick question for everyone to answer, as I stated earlier. We will be sending you a gift from Neovera for your participation. This will go out to the first 3 viewers to place your answers in the chat window. So the question is actually on the screen. When considering business continuity, disaster recovery for a larger deployment, where are you going to put your data and why? All right, now back to you, Andy, to further discuss the question.
So this is an example of one of the decisions that must be made at the beginning of your journey to the public cloud. In this case, the decision affects your DR or business continuity planning. Regardless of the decision for an active-active or an active-passive setup, small or large, you need to consider where you deploy your assets. For this example, consider these regions in Azure: US East, US East 2, US West, and US Central. Each of these is considered geographically diverse for BCDR purposes, but not all things are equal. If one was to deploy in US East, you could choose any other region to deploy your secondary systems, but there are design reasons not to choose some combinations. Let's take the example as if you were in US East. You should pair in US West, but not with US Central or US East 2, even though they're geographically diverse. Likewise, if you're in US East 2, you should pair with US Central, not US West or US East 2. Now, there are more than a few reasons for these pairings, but this is where first 3 people to just come up with an idea of why these are important. We'll hopefully get some responses.
Any takers on the question? And it's posted to the chat window. Anyone want to take a stab at what the answers are?
Well, we'll give you a moment, and then I will give you some of the top reasons. Well, since I don't see anyone actually responding, I will just go ahead and move forward. So when you're in Azure, you have to consider Azure storage, geo-redundant storage, which is storage separated across multiple regions. It is configured by default on these pairings that we gave you. When you're doing Azure SQL databases, Azure SQL database geo-replication, again, is paired across these regions in this manner automatically. In the event of something happen, a broad outage across Azure, recovery of the regions is prioritized. And in this case, the pairing means that one of those two regions will be prioritized over other regions. If you were in US East and US East 2, it is possible that US Central and US West could be prioritized over your own regions, and therefore you'd be delayed on your recovery. By making sure you're in one of these two regions, your recovery is prioritized properly. And finally, there's sequential updates. When Azure actually rolls system updates out across their environment, they will always make sure not to apply the same update to both of these regions at the same time. So by doing this in a rolling manner, they can make sure that this update won't affect multiple regions that you might be in. Now I've talked about those. There's actually more reasons than just that, but those are just, so you can go to the Azure Best Practices document for paired regions, and they'll explain it in a little bit more detail. Obviously, before starting your cloud journey, you should familiarize yourself with the best practices of each of the cloud providers you are considering.
Andy, it looks like Andy, sure, looks like we have a winner here. Wally, he posted a question, an answer, I suspect. So in the question window. Congratulations, Wally. All right.
Guillermo.
All right, so Andy, are you gonna talk us through this case study now?
So this is a case where that was one of the questions we had to ask at the beginning of, where are we going to host the data? This was a much more complex migration case study. Setting the stage for this case study, the customer's goal was to grow their business by acquisition, but doesn't want to own the physical assets. From their goal, they've developed a desire for 100% cloud-based end state. Fairly simple. This opportunity came to us as the client had acquired 3 different sets of assets. We'll call them companies A, B, and C. Companies A and B were acquisitions in total and small in nature. For companies A and B, the lift and shift of some of their assets and a move of their users to Office 365 was all that was needed. However, the assets of company C were quite a bit more extensive. The complexity here came from the fact that the assets acquired were only a part of a larger parent organization. Coupled with a short time frame and financial penalties for exceeding this, put constraints on what could be rebuilt or refactored versus what had to be rehosted. As you can imagine, it wasn't easy to pull those assets out while coordinating with the parent IT department that was remaining behind and keeping both sets of operations active, separate, and secure. One of the challenges was that while all the servers were Microsoft Windows servers, some of the operating systems of the acquired assets included Windows 2008 servers. The short time frame I mentioned before meant we had to do a rehost of those servers instead of rebuilding on newer versions or refactoring the applications and services. This fact was important because it drove our decision to host in Azure. The advantage of doing this is by choosing the Azure public cloud for hosting those 2008 servers, Microsoft extended the support of the 2008 operating system beyond their normal end of support. Challenge number 2, not all of the IT personnel who managed or developed these assets were transferring with the acquisition, so extensive knowledge transfer is required. To that point, we had to learn where the dependencies and links between the acquired company and the parent were, how to separate those links, as well as finding all the little things that might slip through the cracks. This included everything from service accounts with unknown passwords to who owned or controlled each of the website certificates. As if that wasn't enough complications, the inventory wasn't just the company's internal assets, but included third-party apps and vendors, which ended up presenting their own challenges. For applications, consider backups. This is a financial company with long-term retention for regulatory and legal reasons. There was no way to separate the stored backup images from the selling company's other backups, so contracts for archiving and long-term discovery had to be put in place. As we went through our discovery and design, it was determined that some of the outside vendors have requirements for physical endpoint equipment that they own and manage. That required us to host part of the solution in Neovera's private cloud and data center space. For those of you who are attending, if you have on-site routers and terminals, you should be aware that Azure, Amazon, and other cloud providers do not let people put third-party equipment into their sites. Thus, a public-private hybrid was developed. For our final architecture, had to integrate offices and vendors across multiple regions, while dealing with the financial data that had to be kept secure. To that point, for a remote access, a Citrix Cloud solution was chosen to replace the original on-prem Citrix solution. That was what was familiar to the client support people, and the SaaS offering met their needs without needing to stand up their own Citrix farm. Finally, throughout the project, we had to work with the stakeholders to develop SLOs and SLAs for services, along with deploying instrumentation for monitoring and security of the environment. While the public and private clouds, as well as the SD-WAN sites, if you're not monitoring them, how do you know what's happening? Finally, the end state. It was what the customer desired by achieving a deployment to a hybrid environment that touched all of the bases. We had a public and private cloud utilizing IaaS and PaaS services, SaaS services for remote access and monitoring, as well as data center space for the required access. Revisiting back to the 5 Rs, let's talk about how we applied them in this case. Rehosting. Using IaaS, Server 2008 and legacy applications were shifted to the public cloud using Zerto. This allowed migration from the original VMware format to the native Azure with little or no downtime. Refactoring. We moved the public and private load balancing sites from F5 appliances to native Azure application gateways, essentially layer 3 and 7 load balancing. However, because of the tight time frame for the transition, we were now able to move them to the Microsoft SQL PaaS solution. That was left for the future. Re-architecting. Vendor requirements and certifications required us to change our initial strategy from 100% public. Private cloud hosting is required for some of their applications, as well as the physical assets that cannot be done without. Rebuilding. Some of the services cannot move from the selling company. DNS, VPN, backup services. They're all areas that had to be built from scratch. FortiGate appliances were used for the firewalls, SD-WAN, and VPN connectivity. Cloud-based backups using Commvault, now hosted and stored in the public cloud. And then there's replacing. In the case of remote access, the Citrix SaaS solution, or Citrix Cloud as some call it, was used to replace the legacy remote access. I'll hand this back to you, Dana.
Thank you, Andy. Now we're going to dig in a little bit on how to achieve a successful migration. You'll need to be sure that everyone in your organization understands the motivations for moving to the cloud. Perhaps your data center contract is expiring, or you have a bunch of end of support technologies that support your critical business functions. Maybe you've been mandated with new compliance requirements, or you want to build new technical capabilities. You just have to make sure everyone can answer the question, why are you moving to the cloud? This involves aligning the people, process, and technology around these motivators to achieve your business goals. If there is any inadequate or misaligned motivations, you could be facing a lot of resistance in the organization. One of your motivators may be cost savings, but the cloud is not always cheaper without proper cloud and data governance. So you need to bear in mind that enforcing security and compliance standards is not an out-of-the-box experience across public cloud providers. You need to have the right governance framework that will help you rationalize which workloads or applications should be slated for cloud adoption. And this case study talks to compliance and governance. So here's an example where our client migrated their on-prem software solution to the cloud, and it required a rebuild so they could transition to being a software as a service provider. The firm was successful in the rebuild, but soon learned that their cloud solution was lacking proper cloud and data governance. So they engaged Neovera to review their existing environments and architecture and make recommendations for an overarching framework. As part of that, we produced a new desired state architecture and standards, recommendations across environments that even included standard naming conventions. We built an IAC tool, which is infrastructure as code, that included the security controls so that there would be consistency in the configurations across all the environments. So there's dev, test, fraud, etc. There had been a lot of configuration drift along the way. So we had to go back and sync up a standard configuration for them. The IAC tool also included standard system monitoring. There was a big gap in that capability as well. In addition to support operational maintenance and stability, an entire suite of fully automated tasks were developed for the Cloud Ops team. And of course, we stood up security monitoring with Azure Sentinel. This included the creation of hunting queries, workbooks, and other dashboards, as well as threat intelligence. This security monitoring is also implemented across the on-prem, Azure, IaaS, and PaaS models. In parallel to all of the above work, we launched compliance efforts that included establishing corporate policies and procedures. The firm did not have a bank of those. So we looked at, as I mentioned previously, we looked at how the people, the process, and the technology was already functioning. And we took that as our baseline and put controls around it, because we didn't want to have to go in and tell them they have to change the way they work. It was just adding a layer of control around how they already execute day to day. We also provided them an RBAC, which is roles-based access control governance model, and that helps access controls in their platform. Vulnerability management also needed to be established, and so ongoing vulnerability management is actively working. And of course, don't want to forget about the securing all the endpoints, especially the employee laptops. So we ensured that all of that is working, and it's all hooked into the Sentinel monitoring tool to give us insight into how secure the platform is and what the folks are doing. So this is an example of a hybrid on-prem IaaS PaaS solution. And then now Andy's going to try to pull together what we've talked about today, giving a logical view of a reference architecture.
So, as you said, this is a logical view of a reference architecture for a hybrid multi-cloud framework. It's quite a busy slide, so I'll give you a few seconds to absorb the information. Looking at the picture on the right, let me give you a walkthrough. The center in light blue is organized from bottom to top, taking inspiration from the OSI 7-layer model. For physical layer being the cloud providers at the bottom, up to the top where the users are. To the right side, all the security layers, and to the left, general infrastructure management and services required, as well as reporting and governance to keep your environment running. Now, considering this diagram and all its components, for a small organization, there are a lot of things that you might think you don't need. I would bet that at some level, you're already doing it. For example, when was the last time you had to go through a SOC or a user audit? Perhaps you got asked about growth for budgeting. Maybe you were one of those people who got cybersecurity insurance. So, you probably are doing some of these things already. You're just not thinking about it in this manner. For a larger organization, when you introduce all the components, that management and governance layer becomes even more important. Consider VM sprawl, where users are empowered to have VMs created as needed. Your VM growth can explode. But who tracks the VM creation? Who authorizes the expenditure? For how long does a VM last and when is it decommissioned? Your security and basic IT services have to wrap all of these. Finally, whatever the size of your organization, to keep sane in all of this, you really have to look at automation. If you don't, either your manpower is going to grow significantly, or you're going to bog down in trying to do all the tasks required. Regarding the last, consider that if you're not being responsive enough, users are going to get tired of waiting and go off and do their own thing outside of the IT department's control or vision. The birth of cloud computing has made that just too easy. Let's discuss a couple of other things here I've mentioned: automation and costs. One might think that providing all these tools and putting all the procedures and governance in place is going to be expensive. And it could be. Some tools like Terraform do cost money for support. And if you're integrating something like ServiceNow, However, there are a number of open source initiatives like Ansible that allow you to build things with code. You heard Dana mention IAC. That's infrastructure as code. It's a core around being able to script and automate functions in the cloud. By using code for deployments, you can also make sure that things like your monitoring, your backups, security, and BCDR requirements are integrated from the start. That automation alone can save you from missing things and allowing you to speed up the deployment process. Deciding from the start what your IT department wants to support and what your customers' needs are, you can build a service catalog that will enhance your ability to be agile and respond to your consumers' needs. Costs. Let's talk the dirty secret. Everything costs in the cloud. Moving to the cloud could quite possibly not save you money in the long run. So consider an unfunded mandate or a project. If you currently own your own hardware, you probably have excess capacity. If a project is brought to you that needs some dev servers, you can probably stand up a couple of VM, give them the available resources, and it's no bother. If it goes to production and you need more resources, budget will probably be made available if you need the additional capacity. Now take that same scenario with you being in the cloud. Everything is metered. What was something you could do before with no need for additional money is now going to hit your budget. Stand up 2 VM for dev purposes, and you're going to see it in your monthly bill. It doesn't sound like much, but it will add up over time. This is where the governance and reporting comes into play. Someone makes a request. Who approves it? Are they aware of the cost? And do you have the chargeback mechanism in place to apply those costs to the right person's budget? Having said that, there is also some ways to save money. If you have a guaranteed amount of required CPU and storage that you know your applications are going to need, and you're going to have a certain amount of data stored, there are reserved instances where you can sign up in advance for a minimum amount of that. It's basically like a commit on your bandwidth. You agree to pay a minimum amount, and if you don't use it, you're still going to pay that. If you go over it, you will pay an overage charge. But that minimum commit allows you to save money on that base amount of compute and storage. So these are some things to consider about, and hopefully this logical reference gives you some idea about all the things that you need to start thinking about in your own heads. I'm going to hand this over to Shar.
All right, thanks, Andy. So we are at the Q&A portion of our presentation today. So let's see what questions we have for Dana and Andy to answer. The slide's going to be made available to participants. Yes. A link is going to be sent at the end of this presentation, along with downloadable case studies that we've discussed throughout this, this entire PowerPoint. So now for our second question, Guillermo had asked earlier on, and I believe this was during Dana's discussion, the start of the discussion of the cloud deployment models. The question was, can this be used with VM solutions already existing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So just as an example, Guillermo, is when we were moving things, we had existing VMs. We're done VMware or Hyper-V. Tools for Azure Migrate or Zerto can be used to rehost your applications or move them between different cloud providers depending on costs. So a lot of this idea of rehosting and rebuilding can be used with what you have now. And also, that's a cost savings. I'm going to just throw that in. If you already have a tool, look at how it could be applied to the private cloud or the public cloud. There's no reason for you to buy new tools and spend money that you don't need to.
Okay. Thank you. Now, we have a question from Wally Whedon. He did say that he had to leave, but there may be some other people that were thinking about this question, so we're still going to ask it. This was during the Revisiting the 5 Rs section. He was asking if the current scenario solution initiated as a cost reduction or a capacity expansion initiative. So was that current scenario solution initiated as a cost reduction or a capacity expansion initiative? And then was there an ROI included?
So I believe this was during the multi-cloud case study, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
And then the 5 Rs where we talked about.
Yes.
So it wasn't necessarily a cost benefit. There was a technical requirement and an idea that the originating company wanted to move to an OpEx instead of a CapEx model, meaning they wanted to have a monthly spend on their IT services rather than having to worry about budgeting over the long term. They're growing by acquisition, so their IT department is going to grow as they acquire more companies. And they wanted to be able to do that in an ordered manner instead of having to worry about, do we have enough resources for this company to be acquired? Or are we going to have to more budget? By going to the cloud, that gave them that flexibility. Now, return on investment is really about the idea of their consolidation. It's a business consolidation rather than IT consolidation. By acquiring these similar companies, they're able to merge their functions and they're gaining cost savings in that manner rather than on the IT side. Hopefully that everyone understood what I was talking about there. Is there anything else?
Right now, no, there aren't any other questions. Wally had dropped
there's
in.
a new one.
There was one.
Oh, I do apologize. There is, yep, there is a new one. So Keegan has asked advantages versus disadvantages between web-based cloud hosting versus virtual machine cloud hosting.
I'm going to take that as PaaS versus IaaS. So say you have a company like web.com or someone like that who lets you do website hosting and such, and they're providing everything on the back end. Is that what you mean by web-based cloud hosting?
Keegan, if you're still on, if you could just clarify that question for Andy, he'd be more than happy to complete the rest of the answer. The answer is yes, Andy.
Okay. So it really is depending on your size. If you're going to do something like that, you're going to go to a provider. You're going to use the tools that they have to build your sites, to host, whether it's a WordPress site or something else. You're going to just use their advantages on everything. And in some cases, that will be a cost savings and a management savings. Not just the cost of your application, but think about all the things on the back end you no longer have to worry about. You're using a database. The database has to be patched. You have to license it. There's a lot of cost savings that can go into using the PaaS solution. And it's going to simplify on your IT management side, not having to worry about patching all these instances or if something's down, who did what. If you go to the virtual machine cloud hosting that IaaS, where you've actually taken a VM and you've put it up into Azure or Amazon, and you're now responsible for that operating system. You're now responsible for your network security. There are those advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, if you have an edge case, though, where Amazon doesn't have this service that you are running on your virtual machine, you don't really have a choice that you're going to host it yourself because of that. So there's a limitation on what the cloud provider provides versus what you want to use.
Okay. At this point right now, I don't see any other questions, so I will open it back up. Do we have any other questions from any of the other attendees today? Okay. Well, with that in mind, we are at the end of the presentation. So in addition to sending out the link to this recording, we will also be sending the case studies for you to download. But if you do happen to have further questions or would like to speak with Neovera, please email us at info@neovera.com, and we'll be more than happy to set up a time to speak with you, answer your questions. So that is the end for today. We thank you all for attending our webinar and wishing you a great day.
Hope everyone has a good day.